Was he poorly advised, or was it just his own poor judgment? In every single one of his government scandals till date, far from being the decisive man of conscience he promised to be, he has shriveled from leadership. He has dodged responsibility. He has hidden behind others, just as he's doing today, and he has come to this House and hidden behind process and loyally.
The death spiral, how Labour went from landslide to last place in just 365 days. Welcome back to UK Connors, where we dissect the ruthless reality of British politics without the sugarcoating. If you're not already subscribed, hit that button now, because what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you view Keir Starmer's government and the seismic shift happening beneath Westminster's very foundations. Just over 12 months ago, Sir Keir Starmer stood triumphant at number 10, basking in the glow of what political commentators called a generational landslide. The Labour Party had swept to power with a mandate that seemed unshakable, the Conservatives were in tatters, and the political establishment breathed a collective sigh of relief that normal service had been resumed. But here's the thing about British politics. It's more volatile than a Sunday roast argument, and today's hero is tomorrow's zero faster than you can say U-turn. Because what happened this week should send shivers down the spine of every Labour MP, every political strategist, and frankly, anyone who thought they understood the direction this country was heading. A new poll has just dropped that doesn't just challenge a conventional wisdom, it obliterates it entirely. Labour, the party that won a landslide just 13 months ago, has plummeted to a catastrophic 16%. Let that sink in for a moment. 16%. That's not just a political stumble, that's political Armageddon. But here's where it gets truly extraordinary. They're now tied with Conservatives at exactly the same dismal figure. The Tories, who were supposed to be in the wilderness for a generation, licking their wounds and rebuilding from scratch, are suddenly level pegging with the government. It's like watching two heavyweight boxers knock each other out simultaneously, except this isn't entertainment. This is the future of British democracy hanging in the balance. Now, before we dive deeper into this political earthquake, let's establish some context, because the numbers alone don't tell the full story. When Starmer walked through that famous black door, he carried with him the hopes of millions who had grown weary of Conservative chaos. The promise was simple: competent governance, economic stability, and an end to the soap opera politics that had defined the previous administration. Yet here we are, barely a year later, and those same voters appear to have delivered a verdict that's more damning than any opposition attack. The poll, conducted between September 17th and 18th by Find Out Now, represents a 3-point drop from just a week earlier. In political terms, that's not a decline, that's a nosedive. What makes this particularly brutal is a trajectory. This isn't a momentary blip or a bad week. This is a continuation of a pattern that suggests something fundamentally broken in Labour's relationship with the British public. But while Labour and the Conservatives engage in this mutual destruction, there's a third player in this drama that's been quietly, methodically, building an empire while the traditional parties tear each other apart. Reform UK, led by the perpetually controversial yet undeniably effective Nigel Farage, sits comfortably at 34%. Read that again, 34%. That's not just first place. That's a commanding lead that would translate into a parliamentary majority so overwhelming it would reshape British politics permanently. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This represents a fundamental realignment of British politics that makes Brexit look like a minor constitutional adjustment. Reform's rise isn't built on the traditional foundations of manifesto promises and policy papers. It's built on something far more powerful and far more dangerous to the establishment: genuine public discontent with the entire system. The methodology behind Reform's success is as fascinating as it is terrifying for mainstream politicians. According to the polling data, they've achieved something that political scientists would have deemed impossible just 2 years ago. They retained virtually all of their 2024 general election support, a feat that speaks to a loyalty and commitment among their base that traditional parties can only dream of. But it doesn't stop there. More remarkably, Reform has captured a staggering 64% of those who didn't vote in 2024 but now say they would definitely vote in the next election. This isn't just political engagement. This is political activation on a scale that should terrify every sitting MP regardless of their party affiliation. These aren't swing voters moving between traditional options. These are people who had given up on the system entirely and are now being drawn back by a message that explicitly rejects everything the current system represents. Perhaps most concerning for the Conservative Party's long-term survival, reform has won over 38% of 2024 Conservative voters. This isn't tactical voting or temporary protest. This represents a fundamental shift in allegiance among the traditional right-wing base. The Conservative Party, which has dominated British politics for over a century, is hemorrhaging support to what was once considered a fringe movement. The Liberal Democrats, meanwhile, remain stuck at 12%, seemingly unable to capitalize on the chaos surrounding them. For a party that has historically positioned itself as a sensible alternative when the two major parties fail, their inability to break through in this environment speaks to a deeper problem with their messaging and positioning. They are like spectators of their own political funeral, watching while reform claims a mantle of insurgent change that the Lib Dems once believed was rightfully theirs. The Greens, at 13% with a modest 1-point gain, represent the environmental conscience that seems increasingly irrelevant when voters are concerned about more immediate economic and social pressures. Their steady but unspectacular performance suggests that climate change, while important, isn't the driving force behind voter dissatisfaction that many predicted it would become. But let's address the elephant in the room. What has gone so catastrophically wrong for Labour that they managed to squander a historic mandate in just 12 months? The answer isn't simple because the problems aren't simple. This is about more than policy failures or communication mistakes. This is about a fundamental misreading of the public mood and the nature of the victory they achieved. Labour's 2024 victory wasn't built on love for their program. It was built on exhaustion with conservative chaos. Voters didn't choose Starmer because they were inspired by his vision. They chose him because he represented stability and competence after years of political turbulence. But stability without progress, competence without achievement, quickly transforms from reassurance into frustration. The harsh reality is that Labour inherited a country in crisis and promised solutions they were never equipped to deliver. The economic challenges were always going to be enormous, but the expectation management was catastrophic. Voters were led to believe that change would be swift and tangible, that the mere act of removing the Conservatives would unlock prosperity and progress. When that didn't materialize, disappointment turned to anger, and anger has turned to abandonment. Moreover, Starmer's government has fallen into the classic trap of believing that governing from the center automatically commands centrist support. But center-ground politics only works when voters believe the center can deliver results. When it can't, or when it won't take the bold action that desperate times demand, voters don't move to a different centrist option. They move to the extremes, seeking anyone, who promises to break the system that's failing them. Reform's appeal isn't complicated. It's the appeal of the political Molotov cocktail. When people feel ignored, abandoned, and betrayed by the establishment, they don't want subtle policy adjustments or measured compromises. They want revolution. And reform offers exactly that, a complete rejection of the political consensus that has governed Britain for decades. This is where the danger lies, not just for Labour or the Conservatives, but for British democracy itself. Reform's rise represents something more profound than political change. It represents a potential collapse of the post-war consensus that has shaped modern Britain. Their success suggests that increasing numbers of voters are willing to gamble everything on a movement that explicitly promises to tear down existing institutions rather than reform them. The international context makes this even more concerning. Across Europe and North America, we're witnessing the rise of populist movements that thrive on exactly this kind of mainstream political failure. From Trump's resurgence in America to the AfD's gains in Germany, the pattern is depressingly familiar. Economic frustration combined with political incompetence creates space for radical alternatives that promise simple solutions to complex problems. What makes Britain's situation particularly precarious is the speed of this transformation. Most populist movements build slowly over decades, gradually chipping away at mainstream support through economic downturns and cultural conflicts. Reform has achieved in months what took similar movements years to accomplish elsewhere. This suggests either exceptional political skill on their part or exceptional incompetence from their opponents, possibly both. The Conservative Party faces perhaps the most existential crisis in its modern history. Having been decimated in 2024, they had hoped that Labour's inevitable struggles would provide them with a natural path back to relevance. Instead, they find themselves competing for scraps while Reform claims a lion's share of right-wing discontent. Their challenge isn't just winning back Reform voters, it's proving they deserve to exist as a separate entity at all. For the Conservatives, the mathematics are brutal. If they can't distinguish themselves from reform in the minds of right-wing voters, then reform's superior momentum and clearer messaging will inevitably absorb their remaining support. The Conservative Party could find itself in the unprecedented position of being the junior partner in a right-wing coalition, assuming they survive as an independent force at all. Labour's challenge is different but equally severe. They need to demonstrate that mainstream politics can deliver results, but they are operating within constraints that make dramatic change nearly impossible. They inherited massive debt, international economic headwinds, and social problems decades in the making. Solving these issues requires either time they don't have or radical measures they are philosophically unwilling to take. The cruel irony is that Labour's very competence may be working against them. Previous governments could blame their failures on incompetence, corruption, or external circumstances. Starmer's government can't make those excuses. They are clearly trying, they are obviously honest, and they are undeniably organized. When competent people fail to deliver results, voters don't blame the circumstances. They blame the system itself. This creates a feedback loop that's incredibly difficult to break. The more Labour struggles despite their competence, the more voters conclude that the entire framework of British politics is broken beyond repair. And once voters reach that conclusion, they become receptive to anyone promising to smash the system and start again, regardless of what they are proposing to build in its place. The polling methodology suggests this isn't a temporary protest or momentary frustration. The retention rates among Reform voters, combined with their success in mobilizing previous non-voters, indicates a movement with genuine staying power. These aren't people expressing dissatisfaction with current policies. These are people rejecting the entire political framework that created those policies. What's particularly ominous is Reform's success among those who are completely disengaged from politics. Political scientists have long known that bringing non-voters back into the system usually benefits radical movements rather than moderate ones. People don't abstain from voting because they are satisfied with subtle differences between mainstream parties. They abstain because they believe the entire system is irrelevant to their lives. When such people do return to political participation, it's typically because someone has offered them something genuinely different, not a better version of what exists, but a complete alternative to what exists. Reform has successfully positioned itself as that alternative, and the numbers suggest they are converting skepticism into genuine enthusiasm at a rate that should alarm anyone who values political stability. The implications extend far beyond domestic politics. Britain's international relationships, from EU negotiations to the special relationship with America, depend on predictable, stable governance. A Reform government would represent such a dramatic departure from established norms that it would force a complete recalibration of how other countries engage with Britain. Moreover, financial markets abhor uncertainty, and a genuine possibility of Reform gaining power would likely trigger exactly the kind of economic instability that initially drove voters away from the Conservatives. The cruel paradox is that voting for Reform as a solution to economic problems would likely create even worse economic problems, but by then it may be too late to reverse course. The established media's response to these numbers has been predictably dismissive, with various commentators suggesting that polling this far from an election is meaningless, that Reform support is soft, or that tactical voting will ultimately prevent any radical transformation. Such analysis misses a fundamental point. This isn't about predicting election outcomes. It's about understanding the collapse of public faith in the entire political establishment. When a governing party falls to 16% after just 1 year in power, that's not a bad poll. That's a democratic crisis. When the official opposition can't capitalize on government failure because they're equally unpopular, that's not temporary weakness. That's systemic breakdown. When a party that didn't exist in meaningful form 2 years ago commands more support than both historic major parties combined, that's not a protest vote, that's a revolution. The speed of these changes also suggests that traditional electoral calculations no longer apply. The assumption that voters ultimately choose safety over uncertainty, that incumbency provides advantages, and that mainstream parties can count on tactical voting to prevent radical outcomes. All of these assumptions are being challenged by developments that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Perhaps most troubling is the apparent permanence of these shifts. Previous political upheavals in British history, from the rise of Labour in the early 20th century to the SDP breakaway in the 1980s, unfolded over decades with clear warning signs and opportunities for established parties to adapt. This transformation is happening so rapidly that adaptation may be impossible, By the time the mainstream parties understand what's happening, it may already be over. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. Reform's rise coincides with similar movements across the democratic world, suggesting this isn't merely a British phenomenon, but part of a broader crisis of liberal democracy. The solutions at work for previous challenges, economic growth, social reform, international cooperation, may be inadequate for problems that question the legitimacy of the entire system. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all: what if reform is right? Not about their specific policies or their particular solutions, but about their fundamental premise that the current system is broken beyond repair? What if the reason mainstream politics can't solve contemporary problems isn't incompetence or bad luck, but because those problems require approaches that are incompatible with democratic consensus building and institutional constraint? The rise of reform forces us to confront the possibility that the political framework that served Britain well for decades may no longer be fit for purpose. Climate change, technological disruption, global economic competition, and social fragmentation may require responses that democratic politics is structurally incapable of providing. If that's true, then reform's authoritarian alternatives become not just attractive but potentially necessary. Of course, this analysis assumes that reform solutions would actually work, which is far from certain. Authoritarian movements have a long history of promising transformation while delivering chaos, of claiming to represent the people while serving narrow interests, and of breaking systems without building better replacements. The gap between reform's promises and their likely performance in government could be as large as the gap between Labour's promises and their current reality. But here's the crucial difference. When mainstream parties fail, voters have alternatives within the system. When radical parties fail, they typically blame external enemies, democratic constraints, or insufficient power, and demand even more radical measures. The cure for failed authoritarianism is usually more authoritarianism, not a return to democratic norms. This is why these polling numbers represent more than a political crisis. They represent a potential point of no return. Once voters lose faith in democratic institutions, restoring that faith becomes exponentially more difficult. Once radical movements gain power, they have strong incentives to prevent the kind of peaceful transfers of power that make democratic recovery possible. The remaining time for course correction is rapidly diminishing. Labour has perhaps 18 months to demonstrate that competent governance within existing institutions can deliver meaningful improvements to people's lives. The Conservatives have even less time to prove they deserve to survive as an independent political force. The Liberal Democrats need to find a message that resonates with voters who are rejecting moderation itself. But the biggest challenge may be convincing voters that democracy itself is worth preserving. That's not a political argument. That's a philosophical one. It requires making the case that the slow, frustrating, compromise-laden process of democratic governance produces better outcomes than the swift, decisive, unaccountable alternative that reform represents. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're not just choosing between different policies or different leaders. We're choosing between different systems of government, different concepts of citizenship, and different visions of what Britain should become. The polling numbers suggest that choice may already be made, but politics is full of surprises, and democracy has survived crises before. What happens next will determine whether Britain remains a stable, pluralist democracy or becomes another example of how quickly established systems can collapse when they lose public support. The answer lies not just in Westminster's corridors of power, but in the choices ordinary voters make when they decide whether to work within the system or tear it down entirely. These aren't just numbers in a poll. They are a warning signal that the country we thought we knew may already be gone, replaced by something unpredictable and potentially unrecognizable. Whether that transformation leads to renewal or catastrophe remains to be seen, but ignoring it is no longer an option. The revolution may not be televised, but it's certainly being polled, and the results should terrify anyone who values the stability and prosperity that democratic governance, for all its flaws, has provided for generations. Britain stands at a crossroads, and the path we choose will echo through history long after these particular politicians have left the stage. That's where we stand today, at the precipice of a transformation that could reshape not just British politics, but British society itself. These polling numbers aren't just about the next election. They're about the next chapter in our national story. Make sure you're subscribed to UK Connors, because this story is far from over, and the next developments will be even more shocking than what we've witnessed today. The old Britain is dying, and what's being born in its place will determine our fate for generations to come.